مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. لقد استخدمنا هذه الأمثال القديمة عدة مرات من قبل. هذه أفضل الأوقات، هذه أسوأ الأوقات، ووعد الشخص يحدد آرائه، والجمال في عين الناظر. هذه الأمثال نفس بدقة وعد الاقتصاد الأميركي مع بداية عام 2022. من ناحية الاقتصاد هو بحالة رائعة. نحن في طريقنا لتحقيق أكبر نمو منذ ما يقارب 40 عاما. نقترب من العودة إلى المستويات التشغيل التي كانت لدينا قبل الجائحة. هذا يتضمن حصول كل شخص تقريبا في أمريكا على أجور أعلى. من ناحية أخرى ثمة علامات مقلقة مثل التضخم المرتفع الذي يأكل الأرباح والدخل، بالإضافة إلى الخوف من أن متحورا أكثر فتقا من كوفيد سيدور باقتصادنا مجددا. ومن المؤكد أن صراعنا السياسي في واشنطن لا يقوي الثقة في الاقتصاد. أي قول هو الصحيح؟ نفس الكوب ممتلئ أم نفس الكوب فارغ؟ لمناقشة وضع الاقتصاد الأمريكي في بداية عام الانتخابات يسعدني أن أرحب بمراقبين لهما بصيرة نافذة، بيانكا فاشيني وجيمس أستل. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We've all heard the metaphors: glass half full, half empty, best of times, worst of times. Well, let's take a look at those metaphors and see how they apply to America, the American economy, and our political environment as we begin 2022. I'm delighted to have Bianca Fashini and James Astil to help explain all of this for all our viewers. So let's talk about these two competing narratives and how they're shaping our politics. First, the good news. James, the economy, best growth in 30 years, wages up, real estate up, unemployment down. Is this real? Do people feel it?
Whether they feel it or not, and politics has a lot to say in that. It's for sure real. These are astoundingly impressive numbers to get essentially to full employment in such a short period of time after such a calamity when the pandemic first struck the American labor market is an astonishing achievement. We think have recorded growth in the last quarter of something like 5-6%, which is to say, considerably faster than China was growing at the same time, is an astonishing achievement. And it seems that the labor market, can tighten yet. Wages are rising, as you say. There's still a huge demand for labor.
We'll get to that in a minute. Bianca, do people across America feel all this good news? Is it translating into people shopping, people buying, people just generally enjoying this economic boom?
I think in terms of the message, whether they feel it, especially from Washington, is probably a more complicated question. I do think it's clear that people, obviously the economy has recovered a significant amount since the very beginning of the pandemic. That's simply undeniable, as James was saying. And I know we're eventually going to get into inflation, so I don't want to start talking about that too much. But, looking at the most recent numbers that we saw today from the CPI report, inflation is still really high. And we know that consumers, whether they're actually being hit really hard from those price increases, it still really stresses them out. So the message about whether the economy has fully recovered or is close to a full recovery, I think doesn't always resonate with everyone. I think it really depends on your financial situation.
And Bianca, do you get the sense that President Biden benefits, gets credit for any of the good news? Certainly our politicians get the blame when there's bad news. Is he getting any credit if there's good news?
I think he does, on one hand, get credit for the way that the economy has recovered since he was inaugurated. But I think the big challenge for him right now is that inflation is still high. I mean, it is the highest it's been since the 1980s. And the big issue is that he himself cannot offer one solution to fix inflation. And the Fed is sort of limited in the same way. So for as long as inflation remains, which many economists thought it may have started falling by now, it's going to be on him. And he has been trying to sort of place the blame on certain companies that might be taking advantage of inflation. But we know on the other side of the aisle, Republicans are just fully blaming President Biden. So I think, as the year goes on, as we get closer to midterms, that will probably be one of his biggest challenges.
So James, Bianca has led us down the half-empty worst of times path. How bad is inflation? Does it really hurt people? How does it affect people? Do people really change behavior if prices on some items go up 5, 6, 7%?
For sure, it hurts people. I mean, people notice food price inflation, which is considerable, and especially in the context of shortages of some foodstuffs and many other things because of the supply chain glitches that the pandemic has triggered. We've done some modeling on what you would expect a generic Democratic or Republican president to be at in terms of his approval ratings at this point in his cycle, given the approval rating that Biden started at. We would expect, absent all economic considerations, absent the pandemic, that generic president to have an approval rating of 46%. Biden has a shockingly low approval rating of 42%. Shockingly low, but only a bit worse than you would expect that generic president to have. In other words, hyper polarization and partisanship is what is driving his problem here. It is not the economy.
So you're saying that no matter which president we'd have, most Americans would not think he's doing a great job.
Half of Americans would not think that he was doing a great job.
And what do you think about that analysis, Bianca? Do you think that Joe Biden is, by and large, doing as well as one could expect, perhaps even a little better than one could expect, given some of the challenges that he's faced over his first year in office?
I do think it's certainly a partisan issue, as James was saying. And I think the struggle for President Biden and his White House is the messaging, because if you look at what Republicans are saying, they're just strictly blaming President Biden and his policies for where we are today. And it's very easy and quick and simple for them to say, the reason the economy is where it's at today is because of President Biden. That's why we're at 7% inflation. Whereas with President Biden, his team has not retorted in a simple and easy way, just like the Republicans have, which is why perhaps his approval rating is a bit lower than where it would be otherwise. But we're also in a very unique scenario. The economy has never experienced something like this before. So I think the fact that it's at 42% and not much lower is also, not that bad of a scenario for him to be in.
All right, when we come back after the break, I'm going to ask you about a few other factors that are playing into our national conversation. Of course, Omicron, and we're going to come back and take a look at that in just a moment. 50 years ago, on January 30th, 1972, the world witnessed the worst day in one of the worst, most bitter, most violent ethnic religious conflicts on the globe. This was Bloody Sunday, when 27 unarmed Irish civilians were shot and 14 killed by the British Army during a civil rights march in Derry, Northern Ireland. This was the highest death toll from a single shooting incident during what was euphemistically called the Troubles, the decades-old conflict between Catholic and Protestant in the northern counties of the island of Ireland that have been part of the United Kingdom since 1920 and under British control for centuries before that. Thankfully, we don't hear much about the Northern Ireland conflict anymore because, unlike so many other conflicts, this was resolved through negotiation and compromise, especially the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, in which the group once considered terrorists, Sinn Féin, was recognized as a political party, and all sides agreed to resolve their differences through politics, not bullets or bombs. As we remember the worst of that conflict, let's remember most that sometimes compromise and sanity win out. Again, our guests today include Bianca Fascini. Bianca is a Washington-based economics correspondent for @Newsy, a digital news outlet targeting Zennials, Millennials, and Gen Z, the TikTok generation. She has also covered politics and Capitol Hill. Also joining us is James Astill. James is Washington bureau chief and Lexington columnist at The Economist. Previously, he served as The Economist's South Asia bureau chief based in Delhi, was the energy and environment editor, and the political editor. All right, let's take a look at what has to be the most important issue of the day: Omicron, COVID. It is spiking, but if you're vaccinated, you aren't dying. Good news. Worrisome, but still good news. Does the administration get credit or blame for this medical health situation across the country? Bianca?
I don't think the Biden administration is going to get blame for a new variant popping up. I mean, that's something they simply have no control over. I also think that regardless of any variant that pops up after Omicron, hopefully not many others, but if that happens, or if there's ever another surge, we're in such a different spot now than we were at the very beginning of the pandemic, before we had vaccines widely available, before more than 50% of our population was vaccinated. And we just simply weren't prepared at that time. So now we've been through this we're now entering our third year of the pandemic. We have prepared in many ways. And I think in terms of the economy in particular, businesses big and small have been able to adjust and sort of, roll with the punches if there's another variant or there's another surge or something happens that makes it, difficult for them to move forward like they would have been able to pre-pandemic. So short answer, no, I don't think the Biden administration is going to be blamed, especially considering they're really encouraging people to get vaccinated and boosted and wear masks and do everything that they can to prevent the spread.
So, James, the politics on this issue is in some sense heating up. There's some politicians are reaching the conclusion that there's political benefit to be had in getting really tough on anti-vaxxers, as they're called. We're certainly seeing this in Europe, and it's making its way here in the U.S. Are we going to see a sharper tone, isolating and targeting vaccine-resistant people, perhaps for the political benefit of certain politicians?
I think we'll see a selective and sporadic sharper tone. I don't think actually anybody sees, or any mainstream politician sees, great political benefit in going after a significant minority of the electorate in this way. I think what they are seeing is that the situation is desperate. Unlike Bianca, I tend to think that Biden is absolutely getting it in the neck because of Omicron and just the general sense that Americans are fed up with this pandemic, which he promised to bring an end to, just dragging on and on and on. I sat in on a focus group this week of Biden voters, young college-educated Biden voters in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. And all of them said, we know that the administration can't do very much more on the pandemic. We know that, their public health messaging is what the doctors are advising them to put out. We know that they're not responsible for the anti-vax, anti-masking mob, but we're still fed up and we blame the president for it anyway. You know, who else do we blame? We've had enough of this thing.
So there's an emerging chorus of voices that are calling for a shift in how the government should begin to talk about COVID. Instead of the fight of our lifetime, the battle against COVID, where there's an idea that we should shift to how to learn to live with COVID, just another nasty part of life that we all have to put up with, like irritable people on the highways and traffic and that sort of things. Is that a reasonable strategy? Is that going to succeed to address some of this, or to at least deflate some of this concern? Bianca, what do you think?
I think that it might, changing the narrative in that sense might help the stress level that some people have when thinking about living in a global pandemic that has led to a lot of deaths and a lot of long-term illnesses. I think the messaging is so important, but this is something that we've never been through before. And I think the issue is if you become if it comes off as being too lax, then you're sort of getting close to like crossing the line of being just like, well, let's just give up. I mean, we've been in this for 3 years. We're all tired of dealing with it. We want to move on, but it's still very much an issue that we have to deal with. And I think that was, probably one of the challenges of the 2020 election, because we know President Trump was like, we just have to get back to life. We need to open up businesses, get vaccinated if you want, but don't do it if you feel forced. And then President Biden obviously was sort of forced into taking not that he was forced into this position. Obviously, he feels strongly about people getting vaccinated, but eventually it would be like giving in. And I think that's too big of a risk considering the health risks that it poses to a lot of Americans that have other health issues that we know can be complicated by a virus that we've never dealt with before. So I think that's actually complicated.
Bianca makes a good point. It's very tough to find the sweet spot here between battle of our lifetimes and learn to live with it.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, there is no doubt that learning to live with this thing is the reality and should be the message. And in Europe, where there's much less division over these public health measures, over masking, over vaccinations, we're seeing that message rolled out make sense to voters. In the UK, which was hit by Omicron before almost any other country, and therefore will be sort of the first out of that wave, there's already signs of that message is now sort of the message.
With all this going on, it's clear that the president is eager to get at least one more big win in 2022. Perhaps it's his Build Back Better economic plan. Perhaps it's voting rights. Perhaps it's a Supreme Court justice if Mr. Breyer obliges and retires. What do you think? Is he going to get one more big win before the country shuts down for an election?
There's a lot of time between now and November, so predicting what's going to happen in the midterms feels still impossible. As we've talked about before, during a first-term presidency, it's very common, or at least in modern history, for the opposing party to the president to make gains in the House, sometimes in the Senate, of course, depending on who's up for re-election. But in terms of something like Build Back Better and the economy, we know that's been essentially, the priority as of late. And I think that assuming inflation eventually eases by the time midterms come around, that won't be as much of a fight for him in terms of, bringing voters or keeping voters voting for Democrats versus turning around and voting for Republicans.
So that's an upbeat assessment for the president. And James, final word, what do you think?
I think that the Democrats are going to get hammered in the midterms, and I think there's nothing that they or Biden can do about that. And I think that whatever they pass or don't pass between now and then will be irrelevant.
Well, thank you for underscoring the intelligence of the American voter. For that,
All voters, Rob. All voters.
All voters.
All democracies.
All voters. Very good. All right. James, Bianca, thank you so much for joining us this week on Dakhel, Washington. January 6th, the anniversary of the Capitol Hill insurrection, the most serious, violent, and threatening attack on American democracy since the Civil War, has come and gone. Any hope that its remembrance might trigger a more profound appreciation of what happened and what needs to be done to prevent a recurrence by partisans and supporters of former President Trump and the Republican Party in general has come and gone too. I say all this with profound sadness. As longtime viewers of this show know, I am a strong believer in the two-party system. I believe we need two robust, vibrant political parties, one center-left, one center-right, competing to offer the ideas and the people to lead our country. Neither, in my view, has a foreordained right to hold all the levers of political power, certainly not for an extended period of time, lest our nation be dragged quickly and inexorably in a direction a large share of its people don't want to go. We need the two parties and vigorous competition between them to temper the extremes of the other party and to ensure that reform and change, which our nation always needs, comes at a measured, digestible pace. This competition, constrained by the sometimes arcane rules of our constitutional democracy, are one of the key reasons we have maintained 245 years of uninterrupted democratic government, the longest such period in the history of the world. Alas, as we all witnessed on our television screens last January, maintaining that record is not a foregone conclusion. Thankfully, the Capitol invaders were largely amateurs, armed with clubs and axes, not semi-automatic weapons, or even worse. Their intent was heinous, but their tactics and tools were simple and crude. But what about next time? Will we be so lucky when the next group of insurrectionists takes aim at the machinery of our democracy? How can we be so sure? This is why the collective response of the Republican Party has been, with sadly few exceptions, so objectionable. It is one thing to raise shrieks of protest at alleged electoral violations, to call for recounts in states with close elections, to seek court injunctions even against certifications. All these are legal, if extreme, measures in our constitutional system. But to turn a blind eye to the actions of illegal insurrectionists, let alone to encourage and even enable their murderous attack on the U.S. Capitol, on the lawmakers fulfilling their duties, and on the police safeguarding their efforts, that is outrageous. Why then did virtually no Republican legislators, except the current and former Republican representatives from the state of Wyoming, Liz Cheney and her father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, participate in the Capitol Hill events on January 6th to remember the events of a year ago? It's scandalous, in my view. Life goes on. Republicans and Democrats are fighting each other over budgets and taxes, COVID and nominations, and 100 other issues like cats and dogs. But some things one should never forget. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول العلاقة بين السياسة والاقتصاد في أمريكا، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.